let's go ahead and get started. We have so much amazing learning to do in this session. It is my absolute pleasure and joy to introduce our dear friend Tracy, who is coming in live right now from Daniel Boone Area School District out in Pennsylvania, where she is an impactful and an inspiring instructional coach, willing to kind of share her wisdom with us. And we are just so grateful for you, Tracy, and so excited to learn from you today. So let's go ahead and jump right in.
Perfect. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. It is so lovely to see all of you here today. Even though the weather outside, as I said a little bit earlier, is a little less than stellar. We're going to get through it. It's going to be okay. It's the end of the day. I just thank you all so much for joining me, and thanks to Babs for facilitating this session as she monitors the chat and the Q&A. Please feel free to interact with those resources as we go through the session. In addition, I'm also using the CuraPod platform. Perhaps some of you have heard of it or even used it yourself to present this session and hopefully make it a bit more engaging for you. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to join my CuraPod session. So if you'd like to do that on a separate device, a phone, tablet, laptop, etc., feel free to go ahead and get that device queued up. The bottom line, I am just so glad that you've decided to join me today to talk about a concept that is relatively easy to understand, I think, and so difficult to get to: mastery learning. So we're going to take today to look at some small shifts that have super big impact so that we can move toward that mastery learning in a way that is sustainable and gettable. As Babs mentioned, my name is Tracy Driehaus. I'm a K-12 instructional coach in the Daniel Boone Area School District in suburban Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. My professional journey began about 20 years ago as a high school math teacher. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is based on my own experience in my classroom as a math teacher, and then some other things that I've gleaned and grown over the past 5 years as an instructional coach. So for that first 15 years, I taught everything from entry-level Algebra 1 all the way through pre-calculus and trigonometry, with some advanced algebra thrown in just for the fun of it. And I absolutely loved my job, just like all of you. I came to school every day, ready to work, and so excited to be an educator and make an impact in my students' lives. But I'll be absolutely honest with you, I became kind of discontent. I was trying so hard to grow mathematicians and lifelong learners, but I really felt like my kids weren't in it for the right reasons. I was finding it practically impossible to motivate them, to get them into the learning for the sake of learning. And that dissatisfaction led me to investigate and dip my toes into the waters of mastery learning. So let's dive right in. At this time, I'm going to ask you to join my CuraPod session. You can do that by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by navigating in a web browser to curi.live, CURI.live, and typing in the pen 404344. And I see some people already jumping in. If you've never used this platform, I highly recommend it. It's AI backed. But in this case, I created most of the content here for you today, but I didn't have to. But one of the things it always creates are these very interesting and engaging usernames for all of the users. Kind iPhone, Awesome Sea, Cheering Ocean are always really fun when you do this with kids, and they see all those crazy names that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of on their own. So I'll give it just a couple of seconds. People are still popping into the CuraPod. And if someone comes in later, the CuraPod link will still be at the top of the slide. Anybody can join at any time, but it looks like we got most, if not everyone, in at this time. So today, I'd like to share with you some of what I learned, as I said, on my journey into the concept of mastery learning. In order to do that, we'll look at what exactly is mastery learning, as well as 5 steps that the experts have identified that lead us toward that mastery. And finally, from those 5 steps, combined with my own experiences, and I'm going to be absolutely honest with you, I'm including the successes and the grim failures, I've gleaned really 5 focus areas and instructional moves that teachers can make in their own classrooms in small ways, not just for change, but for sustainable change toward that ideal of mastery. But first things first, to get started here and activate some prior knowledge going in, we're going to start by generating a word cloud in response to this question: what is mastery learning? So let's just take 1 minute or so, throw up on the board the first things that come to your mind when someone mentions that topic. So I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute, and then we'll look at the results. Here we go. I've got 30 seconds. Many words. Okay. Three, two, so let's look at those results. Ooh, I like that. Proficiency, understanding knowledge. Let's see if we've got anything else in there of interest. A complete understanding. I love that because that tells us so much. Standards-based grading. Yes, absolutely. Threshold of competence. So in addition to some of those words that we can really wrap our brain around, but are a little nebulous to get to, we've also got some buzzwords in there. And there are lots of buzzwords around everything educational. And the same is true of mastery learning. When we talk about mastery learning, in addition to all the things that you guys identified on that word cloud, which is fantastic, we're really talking about a learning approach that values mastery on a set of established standards over grade level or age level development. Along with that comes other concepts, which you identified in that word cloud, including differentiated instruction. That's absolutely a component of mastery learning. If I'm going to get kids, if I'm going to meet them where they are and really get them to mastery on their standards from wherever they start, I'm going to have to differentiate what I do and how I approach them, as well as potentially the learning that they engage in order to get to that final destination. And finally, standards-based assessments, somebody mentioned that, play a vital role in mastery learning because, again, in order to really make sure that our kids are demonstrating on those identified standards, we have to be able to understand exactly what we're assessing and to make sure that we're assessing on those standards adequately and accurately to be able to articulate and recognize mastery when we see it. But what does mastery look like? So there are actually 5 steps that the experts have identified that move us toward mastery learning. As I stated before, individually, these are all pretty easy to understand, but they are much more difficult to put into practice as a living system toward a common goal. We can do pieces of these, but to get them to all work in concert towards student learning and student mastery on standards is a heavy, heavy lift. I found it out the hard way, quite frankly, when I tried to go literally all in my very traditional Algebra 1 class and try to turn that into a completely mastery-based approach. But we'll get more into that later. Regardless of the steps to get there, how you choose to implement, mastery always starts with pre-assessment. And from that pre-assessment, setting that baseline, figuring out exactly where kids are at the beginning, we can then begin to provide targeted instruction. That might look like whole group instruction on certain topics on which none of the kids have demonstrated mastery, or they all indicate that they're at a similar or same starting baseline. But conversely, it might look very different on those things that kids come in not necessarily at the same level on all that prerequisite knowledge, or even knowledge along that standard that their peers just don't yet have. From that instruction, then, we do continuous formative assessment. Now, formative assessment, my understanding of it several years ago was you give a quiz midway through the chapter, and that's the formative assessment. And that's one way to do formative assessment, but real formative assessment will be, not it can be, but it will be both formal and informal. It might look like a quick 1-question exit ticket. It might look like that 10-question quiz in the middle of a unit, or it might be a verbal conference with a student. We might be gathering data from analyzing performance on a written task, or from monitoring student work in progress as we circulate about the room during independent or group work time. We're always assessing where kids are, where they're growing, how they're growing, and conversely, where those gaps still exist, so that we can then scaffold or extend them as appropriate for students who are below or consistently performing above the established standard. Obviously, the goal is for every student to get to mastery, but there will always be those students who don't quite get it, who need that true scaffolding, that intense intervention and differentiation with instruction and potentially assessment to get them to that mastery level. Conversely, we're going to have students who start out nearly at or even beyond mastery. They need to go beyond the established standard on that topic because learning, for me, is non-negotiable. Those are the students, by the way, typically just sitting in our classrooms bored, maybe not really engaging, just kind of showing up because they have to, at least at the high school level. And all too often, they're the kids no one really worries about because they never require much intervention from the teacher to perform well on the test. But we should worry about them because learning is non-negotiable. And how do we know when students have reached mastery? Because the summative assessment and grading with which we always in the standard cycle will give us that information. These are the performance tasks that allow students to demonstrate fully their progress on the standard, even if it goes beyond the standard. Nuanced and creative, these summative tasks allow us to really drill down to what our kids know. By tying everything together with a true summative ending, this grading is really where the rubber meets the road. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment, and when we talk about those 5 focus areas and instructional moves specifically. Before we get to that point, what I'd like to do now is just have you dig into your own experience. I've shared a lot of mine with you so far, and I'll share more. But as you see this cycle, the way the experts have outlined it, do you see this cycle currently at work in your work site, whether that's your classroom, your building, or your district? And if so, what areas might need further attention to really make it as robust as it needs to be? If you don't see this cycle happening in your classrooms, buildings, district, what barriers might there exist to impede further implementation? So take just 30 seconds to think about it, and then we'll have a 2-minute window where you can input your answers. So I'm going to set a timer for 30 seconds, and then I'll open it up for the 2-minute answer. This is a long, you can type up to, I think, 300 characters. So go ahead and share your thoughts. Where do you see it? What areas need further addressment and what barriers? Those answers are still coming in, but they're rolling in a little slow. Sometimes it's hard to punch all those buttons. So I'm going to give it an extra 30 seconds just to make sure everybody gets their voice heard. And meanwhile, I'll turn back on the cool jazz so you can jam out while you're four, three, two, one. Very good. So, I love the music in Curipod. It's always surprising me. You can see so many different barriers to implementing this sort of cycle. I love the fact that some people are already doing it and they figured out ways to mitigate those barriers that the rest of us may be still facing. The needs are to better match our formative or summative assessment to the instruction. Huge, right? Making sure all those pieces fit together. Thank you for your answers to that question. Thank you for thinking about it in your own local context. That's so important as we come to things like this. And we hear all these grand plans and all these things that other people are doing, obviously, to bring those back into where we live. So important and vital. So these 5 focus areas and instructional moves that I'm going to share with you, quite frankly, I'm hoping for some of you who identified some of those areas for further growth or barriers that need to be mitigated. These 5 identifications came directly from those spaces, both within my own classroom and then over the past 5 years as I've worked with other teachers across the district to move more toward that mastery style. Specifically, these are the areas in my own instruction and in other classroom practice that I can really point back to as real pivot points in that change process, beginning with the very first one, a focus on feedback. Now, I know what you're going to say. Right? Teachers give feedback and grades all the time. In fact, when I was in the classroom and I'm working with teachers now, I know myself, there were times I always felt like all I did was grade. As soon as I got through one cycle of grading, another stack was sitting in front of me, ready for my attention, just begging for me to get it done. But caution here, feedback is not the same as grades. In fact, I would say that feedback, given well, is so much more productive and valuable than a grade because feedback doesn't play into the points game. So a couple of rhetorical questions for you. How many of you in your own classroom, or if you're an administrator in your own buildings or district, ever encounter kids who complain about the fact that they're asked to do work that they don't get points for you? I can't tell you how many times I had students come into my classroom and who even now going into other teachers' classrooms, kids come in, if you ask them to perform a task, at least one student, if not 20, will invariably raise their hand and say, how many points is this worth? Are we going to get points for this? Do we have to do this? And I'll be honest with you, my own experience when my students did that, it really led me to be really frustrated with them. Again, going back to that salient point that they weren't in it for the right reasons. We weren't showing up and learning for the sake of learning. We were learning maybe for the sake of points. And that made me question whether we were really learning at all. And yet that's the game we taught them. So the first challenge for me, my students and their families was to sound the buzzer on the points game. Learning is not basketball, right? It doesn't matter at the end when the buzzer sounds how many people have the most points. It matters how far we've come and where we've gotten to. So I began not grading. I began giving feedback. What does that look like? Well, I was sitting with kids and going over problems with them as they completed them so that they could see and articulate to me what they were doing, why they were doing it, and then identify the gaps that they were experiencing. I mean, we got to the point where we were really able to talk about what they didn't understand so that together with me and their peers, they could begin to fill in those gaps and really make some true progress toward those standards. I'll be absolutely honest with you, in 15 years of teaching, that was probably the most phenomenal thing I ever saw. I'm not going to say it was easy. Parents, surprising to me, in particular, push back. What do you mean kids aren't going to get graded for all the stuff they're doing? How are they going to pass your class if you're not grading everything? And the kids push back. Why am I doing this if you're not giving me points? But I'll be honest with you too, within the first 6 to 8 weeks of school or so, all of us had really begun to see the value because if they didn't need to do it, if there was a task that wasn't going to help them grow, there were no points that got taken away from them or penalized them if they didn't do it. The penalty came, if it did, when they couldn't perform on those summative tasks, and that began to motivate them. They began to see the connection between all those learning tasks I gave them and then those summative assessments that really told them where they were on those standards. At that point, they went back to all those tasks and they did them for the right reasons when they needed to do them. More importantly, they began to grow and I began to grow because I started to see them as the real learners in the classroom rather than just point scrubbers. In order to do that, I'll be, again, honesty is the name of the game today. We really have to eliminate the meaningless and emphasize the meaningful. That means that if a student is demonstrating mastery on something, asking them to perform a task that helps other students toward mastery just because the other kids need it is kind of senseless. Instead, giving that student a task that extends their knowledge on that standard is so powerful. Now you might ask, okay, well then, Tracy, how do I know what's meaningful? Teachers ask me that all the time. And the short answer is your standards tell you. So the second focus is on those standards. For the first 10 years of my teaching career, I actually probably couldn't have told you which standards I was covering in class at any given time. I knew my standards, don't get me wrong. I knew the document where they were housed and I had read them a couple of times and I knew my curriculum was aligned to them. But what this standard was covering today, there were a lot of days I probably couldn't have answered that question without doing a bit of research. I just kind of went along with the flow. I did what the teachers around me did, what teachers before me did, and quite frankly, what I had experienced myself in the classroom as a student. And then I started looking at mastery. And I realized that if I didn't know my standards and not just where they were housed or how to read them, but if I couldn't articulate what those standards were in a way that was accessible to everybody else, I had no idea what the students were supposed to be mastering at all. How to tell what's meaningful? Well, you take those standards apart. And I don't know about other countries or other states in the United States even, but the one thing I can tell you about Pennsylvania and the United States is that we don't write standards for the sake of teachers, and we certainly don't have kids in mind when we put those things in place. But everybody's held accountable to them. So the first thing I had to do was really take those standards that governed theoretically what was happening in my class every day and dissect them into their little pieces so that I could understand and articulate them, and even better, so that my students could access them, so that they understood what exactly they were trying to get to every day in algebra class. I had to share those with my administration, the teachers on my team, and the families at home, because we were all working theoretically toward a common goal articulated on those standards. And then I had to eliminate the extraneous. And that was hard. Making sure that all the extra stuff is cut out is so difficult for teachers who have been in the classroom for a little while and gotten so tied to the things that they like to do. And yet, when push comes to shove, really don't drive toward those standards. The challenge for me and a lot of the teachers I work with was recognizing which of those things that I was asking kids to do, the different activities that I planned, the different instructional components that I have incorporated, the different assessments that I gave, which of those really pointed toward their standards and helped kids grow toward their standards, as opposed to just the fun things that I wanted to be able to incorporate, the things that I like, the things that were exciting for me from the front of the classroom. But once I began to recognize those things and weed out those that really didn't push towards standards at all, both my students and I were so much happier in that space because we were all showing up to learn for the sake of learning. We were all able to articulate, and I was actually finally able to assess the learning outcomes that I had been working toward ostensibly for all those years with minimal results. You really have to be able to articulate and assess teachers and students along the way what we're trying to get to every day.
I love that. Tracy, there's a little dialogue going on in the chat right now of just how, and you touched on this a little bit, but with so many standards that teachers are expected to teach, what is kind of your advice of how do you prioritize when there's just not enough time to hit mastery of all of those standards?
Well, first of all, that is such a timely dialogue, not just in the context of society and education as a whole, but to this presentation, because that's the next focus. It's really focusing on proficiency, because again, as a state tested subject area teacher, I had proficiency on standards laid out for me by the state in terms of assessment anchors and eligible content, right? And a lot of us fall into that trap. We don't get to decide which are the important standards and which aren't. However, there are a lot of classes, a lot of courses, a lot of grade level content. For me, it was computer science and trigonometry classes primarily, which are not tested. And in those spaces, I had the immense responsibility and the tremendous privilege of deciding, not in isolation, in collaboration with peers and administration, what proficiency looks like. Yes, to your point in the chat, there are so many standards, but are they all equal? And I think I saw that in the chat, that exact question. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But together, my administration and I, my grade level peers, my course level peers and I, we were really able to establish what I'm going to call good enough for our students on those standards. And we often did that by vertically articulating our standards and curriculum. But it didn't stop there. Once we established good enough, we had to be able to clearly articulate to students and families what proficiency looks like on any given topic, because the standards are this big. We had to say, okay, we're worried about this part of that standard, whatever it is. So we really had to be able to be clear and transparent about that. We also had to be able to assess it accurately. In other words, again, if your standard is this big and you're focusing here, but your assessment's over there, then we've got that misalignment that I think someone talked about earlier in the CuraPod. So putting all those pieces together was really important. We also had to keep in mind, and this might be the pertinent point here, that student learning does not always or even often translate elegantly to an objective style, easy to score test. So we really had to get creative with assessment and performance tasks that allowed students to showcase their understanding. For me, that was a huge hill to climb. And this is where I'm going to use that phrase again, the rubber met the road for me. It was conferencing with students. Up until this point in my career, I had always complained about the inability to get to conferencing with students because of time constraints. At this point, those conferences became a daily priority. I flipped my entire classroom. Most of my instruction was done via video outside class so that I could really spend the valuable face-to-face time with students in conference about what they were learning and where their understanding happened to be on that given day. Honestly, prioritizing this use of time was a game changer. And then came the hard part. And this, again, salient to your chat discussion. I had to accept what we had established as proficiency. Whatever had been established as good enough had to be, quite frankly, good enough. So let me give you sort of a real life example that might make it a little easier to access. This is how it was presented to me. And this is about me. This is absolutely true. I love to cook. Rhetorical question. Everybody like to cook? If you don't like to cook, put your hands down. We don't like, I'm just kidding. We do like you very much. But I love to cook. I'm a math teacher. I'm a computer science teacher. I'm an instructional coach. But I love to cook. And if you ask me what relaxes me, what I do when I'm excited, what I do when I'm just having a great day, what I'm doing when I have a bad day, I'm in the kitchen. I'm throwing together a stew. I'm putting muffins in the oven, whatever. I love to cook and I spend time doing it. I read cookbooks. I watch cooking shows. I invest myself in getting better at it, going above what might be the standard for a lot of people. I love to cook. It's where my joy is. So I really dive deep into that. And my good enough is probably not the same as other people around me. But I hate doing laundry. I hate it. It's like the worst thing ever. I don't understand why it has to be done really well, because quite frankly, as long as my clothes are clean enough to put on the next day, that's really all I care about. So cooking, my standard is super high. Laundry, as long as it's clean and I can find it and I know what goes together, I'm perfectly content. So when we talk about standards, we have to be able to really talk about which are the most important. And yes, the state says all of them are important, but when we vertically articulate that curriculum and when we look at what kids need the next day or the next year or 2 years out, we can really start to make those judgment calls. Keeping in mind that for some kids, you're going to define that standard very narrowly and proficiency is going to look very specific. And they're going to say, oh no, that's cooking for me. I want to be the best at that I can be. And they're going to take off with it. Other people are going to look at that same thing and say, you know what, that's laundry. I'm going to do that just good enough because that's really all that matters. And then I'm going to move on to something that is more exciting and interesting to me and that I can really expand outside the bounds of proficiency, that good enough that we established looking at what kids need. Does that help and answer the question? Answer me in the chat and push back, please. Goodness knows I am not the be all to end all in anything. This is just my experience talking. So at the end of the day, how do I know kids in the classroom are nearing or at that good enough? And the answer is because I focus on formative assessment. Many times in my experience, when I'm talking to teachers, if I ask a teacher what's the most important piece of the teaching puzzle, they'll likely say instruction, right? Everybody agree with that? You're a teacher, you're a principal, you're a district administrator. The most important part of teaching is instruction. And don't get me wrong, it's super pivotal. Obviously, everything hinges on that. But formative assessment done well may actually be just as impactful, if not more so. Now before you start like throwing darts or anything, just hear me out. The reason I say that is because formative assessment doesn't just give information about students' learning. It also gives evaluation and future direction for that oh so important instruction. Formative assessment is sort of like the navigational co-pilot that tells us where we've been, where we need to go, and occasionally that we may have to take the car in for service, right? It tells us how to stay on the road in front of us, and occasionally when we need to veer off onto other pathways. When we assess and then use the data that we gather to direct our classroom practice and instruction, we begin to really provide that targeted differentiation and scaffolding that is often the roadblock to ideals like mastery learning. When we really assess and use student performance to talk about what's happening in our classroom the next day, quite frankly, that's when we get to the sweet spot. That's when it all comes together. All those pieces that are so hard to fit, it all comes around formative assessment. But all of these pieces have a glue that holds them together and cannot be neglected. And it doesn't often happen in the classroom. Regardless of whether we're diving into mastery learning feet first or just wading in the shallow end of the mastery learning pool, I'll be absolutely perfectly blunt with you. Communication is the key. I learned this the hard way. Don't do what I did, where I thought what happened in my classroom only affected myself and my students. So I didn't really talk to parents about what I was planning to change or what my motivations were. I talked to my administration, but I just kind of said, I'm going to try something new. Is that okay with you? And they said yes. And then when I hit those roadblocks, I was stymied because I hadn't brought along people for the journey. So the positive impact of the time spent speaking honestly with families, students, colleagues, and administrators, frankly, cannot be overstated. By maintaining that open and frequent communication, even about the issues we see occurring as these changes go into effect in our classrooms, we normalize the new to a group of people whose support we and our students absolutely need to be successful. A group of people who, like everyone else, only knows their own experience and for whom, just like us, change is scary and really difficult. So by communicating clearly, often, and very widely about the changes you want to make, how you're making them, and what the impact is, we not only bring along those others for the ride, but we also draw on that community experience to troubleshoot some of those issues that seem insurmountable to one teacher trying to do it all on her own. When I changed that piece, when I started talking to parents, when I started sending out just blast communications, even about the problems that I was having, I really saw a change in how my classroom functioned, because all that support that had been missing previously was now coming in. Parents were asking questions, and their questions prompted me to question and then be able to find some answers in collaboration with other teachers, my administration, my students, and their families. And that was really, really valuable. So with all that said, Babs, is there anything else in the chat that...
I think you're all caught up. Everybody's just loving what you're saying and agreeing about the formative assessment. So you're on a roll.
Perfect. I love Catherine, who says, I agree, formative assessment is the most important part of instruction. I wondered if somebody was going to call me on that. So thank you, Catherine, for that. I appreciate that. As the last session before the closing keynote, I know that this is a lot of information. I talk really fast, and I've talked fast for a really long time. My throat is dry because of it. And you're piling this on to a lot of information, other valuable information that you've gotten over the last 30 hours or so. So what I'd like to ask you to do now, if I can get all those words out in the right order, I'd actually like you to take a bit of a pause and reflect on how you see mastery learning working within your own context, be it your classroom, your building, or your district. So what I'm going to ask you to do is think about this, this prompt. Cite at least one benefit within your focus area that you will realize when you or your staff make these changes toward mastery learning. And again, if some of you are already really on the path or at a place where mastery learning is occurring, think about those barriers and those areas of growth that you identified earlier. Is there a move here that you could implement or even do better if you're already doing some of it to make that area of growth a little stronger? Or if you're not there yet, to mitigate some of those barriers that you see. So in this case, I'm going to turn my camera off actually, because I feel like this needs a little more thought time, reflection, especially given all the information that has been hitting you for the last 2 days. And I'm going to give us like a minute and a half just to reflect quietly on it. And then I'll open up the response time for you to put in your responses to that. So 2 minutes of thought and then 2 minutes of response. Okay, so as we come to the end of that reflection time, hopefully you've crafted an answer. You see some benefit to either incorporating and or strengthening those areas using those focus areas. So take a moment or two and just respond to that prompt for me, please. I'm in a high school. I apologize for the bell. Time for the last 10. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now we have some answers. I'm actually going to put 2 minutes on the timer. What I want you to do is review these answers on the screen and on your screens, I should say. And you are going to vote on which answers you think might be the most relevant. So go ahead and review those answers, and then you can vote on your choice for which you think might be the most relevant. Very good. It looks like everyone's voted, so I'm going to stop. Oh, there's more people voting. You can vote more than once. Go right ahead. I almost stopped you. I don't want to cut you off. There are really good answers to this question. I haven't seen the answers yet, so I'm taking your votes for it right now. Down to the last 10. 4, 3, 2, 1. Very good. Okay. So the top answer, moving toward mastery learning, will strengthen our core Tier 1 instruction, which means we'll reduce the number of students who need Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction. Absolutely. MTSS is dependent on really, I mean, it's just like working out, right? You got to strengthen that core. And mastery learning absolutely does that. I absolutely agree with that. Other two who made we'll call it the platform, the focus of the classroom will shift from teaching to learning. How beautifully articulated, right? That's where we kind of fall into problems when I, as the teacher at the front of the room, start being the focus and the primary concern in the classroom, as opposed to those students and learners. And finally, teachers can speak to student learning and not just their grades. And somebody put it in the chat, what does a 70% mean? And that is such a salient point, because 70% on one assessment and 70% on a different assessment, even if they're on the same standard, even on the same, we'll call it eligible content, they focus on the same narrow, band of that standard. 70% on those two different assessments could be completely different indicators of where students are on that standard for a variety of different reasons, none of which we might be able to control. So we teach students to cite evidence to support claims, and that's essentially what we're doing here. So important, modeling that for our students, and really honing in on what they know and making it available to them as well. So thank you to all of you for that. I really appreciate it. Just for your information, as we wrap up here this afternoon, all the resources, including the slide deck, I'll put, as someone requested, the responses from the CuraPod. I will export those and make them available as well. All of my resources are in this shared Google Drive. You can access it with the QR code or that tiny URL that I've put on the screen for you at any time. So feel free to dive in there. I have some tracking sheets that I've used with teachers to keep their student data in a place where they can really access it, so they can drill down to what kids know. Also some tracking sheets that I used in Algebra 1 for how to keep track of where kids were. As I said earlier, I flipped my classroom completely. I also made it completely student paced. So at any given time, in her classroom with 18 kids, there may have been 18 different topics occurring in that classroom. So for me to keep track required a lot of creative bookkeeping on the back end, and all of those resources I made available to view in that folder. If there's something that is helpful to you, feel free to avail yourselves of it. And beyond that, thank you so much. And are there any questions? I don't see anything in the chat.
We've still got a few minutes, everybody. So if you have any questions or comments, or just want to pick Tracy's brain as obviously the guru that she is, please feel free to jump in and throw some ideas in the chat.
Well, thank you, Kylie. That's so kind.
I agree. She is definitely goals.
So, Caitlin, as an instructional coach, I have worked with teachers in pockets. I put my high heels back on. Either in pockets of individual teachers working just within their classroom, or grade level teams, course level teams, to really move in that direction. We are still a very traditional institution, however, and so it is my goal that we will eventually be a mastery-based institution, but that's, again, small moves for sustainable change, right? So yes, I've been able to roll it out as an instructional coach, but just like in the classroom when I started this, even 2 years later, I still have a long way to go. And that's kind of how I feel right now, 5 years into that endeavor.
Tracy, do you have any maybe tips and tricks for the group to consider as they're thinking specifically maybe about elementary or secondary? And I know another question just came into the chat, so please prioritize their desire as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, Constance, that's a great question because, again, even when I was doing this in my classroom and the teachers that I'm working with now begin to move in this direction, we're still issuing quarter report cards on an A, B, C, D, F scale, numerically graded. So the way I handled that in my classroom was to say, and I did not decide this in isolation or in a silo, but this was an agreement that I made with administration, my grade level, course level peers. And we came to this conclusion based on conversations with families and students that essentially a 70% is kind of proficient. It's baseline proficient. So as long as students were able to answer 70% consistently, and when I say consistently, I always came back and spiraled. We know how important that is. And so to really demonstrate baseline proficiency, students had to perform on that standard 3 times at disparate points of time. And as soon as they got to that, they were proficient on that standard. And we would still come back and review and bring that back in at different times. This was Algebra 1. So essentially it was a 70 was proficient, and then we called it proficient, and then accelerating, and then mastered. 70, 80, 90 was how we sort of aligned that to the numeric grading scale. I did not grade anything past summative assessments. There was no such thing as homework. There was work that they might have to do at home, but there were no assignments for homework. There were learning tasks that they engaged as they needed to, whether that was watching a video and then doing some practice on that topic, or doing a small group project on that topic, or doing an inquiry-based lesson on those things. But as far as the grading, those were just summative assessments on those standards. Were the assignments in the gradebook the actual standards? Yes, that's exactly how I handled that. And then again, it was cringy to me that I had to align those proficiencies and levels of proficiency, if you will, to a numeric scale. But obviously that's the system that I'm working in, and that the teachers right now who I'm working with on this are working for. So again, that's the agreement that we made locally with administration, that a 70% is proficient. The other thing I did, and some teachers do this, some don't, is anything below a 60, which would be the lowest D. So anything below a 60 is failing. That didn't go into our grade book. So a student tried a summative assessment and they were not able to get even to essentially 60% of the material, then that did not go into the grade book at all. And if they got between a 60 and 70, then they did not have a choice but to try it again, trying to get them to proficiency on those standards. As an interventionist, I love the idea of mastery. I focus on learning gaps or filling gaps and helping students master reading skills slowly at their pace. Yeah, Lalinda, that's exactly the role of an interventionist. And I was fortunate enough, and our teachers are fortunate enough to have interventionists in place now. And I can't overstate the value of the interventionist, because when I'm working toward mastery with 22 kids in a classroom, having that student who is not able to perform on grade level standards because they have those below grade level gaps, or conversely, they're so far above grade level on that standard that I can't really meet their needs. Having an interventionist that I can pull in to support those students or send those students to if they need pull-out intervention in my classroom was super important and so valuable. Again, mastery is all about meeting kids where they are to get them to a shared goal. And sometimes the classroom teachers can't do that all themselves. So the interventionist is so vital to do that. And Caitlin, yes, the students could continue to work on a standard past proficiency. So if there was, we all have those students who I just want that A. Well, now there was some motivation about it, because that required them to say, okay, you're good enough, Mrs. Driehaus, is not good enough for me. And that for some students was exactly what they needed to push them to really work a little harder in some cases and to come back and revisit that. In other cases, students who had struggled with math or maybe they had tried a summative assessment on a standard 2 or 3 times, they were getting frustrated with it. They had to finally say, you know what, that 70 is good enough. Your good enough is my good enough. So that was language that we developed and we used quite a lot to convey to the kids that first of all, you can control some of these things. You kind of dictate, you decide, and you have some power in this situation to decide what you're going to accept from yourself. And for some of my students, that was liberating in a way that I quite frankly didn't expect going into this experiment, if you will. It was actually really cool to see. Yes, Gretel. Some of my colleagues absolutely fought the battle of not wanting students to be able to take summative assessments, or to be able to say, well, you only have a week to retake a summative assessment, and then after that you can't revisit it. And again, talking with families, with students, and working collaboratively with peers and administration, that was actually a philosophy we were able to change for the institution. And now our credo has kind of become, it doesn't matter when, it matters that. Otherwise, it doesn't matter when they learn it, it matters that they learn it. And so we reissue summative assessments whenever students need to demonstrate proficiency because they haven't yet, or if a student requests it. Again, going back to Caitlin's question about can they continue to work past proficiency? And the answer is always yes. I think Babs asked different strategies, elementary versus secondary. Again, my experience as a teacher is secondary. And most of the colleagues that I work with now on this toward mastery are secondary teachers. And a large part of that is because our K-4, so our elementary, primary, and intermediate schools are both already standards-based reporting. So they are already doing mastery-based learning in their classrooms, at least ostensibly. I'm working with individual teachers to help them, again, go back to some of those barriers that people identified in the CuraPod at the beginning of the session, making sure that their summative assessments are aligned to their instruction, and that both those things are then, pointing back directly to their standards, that they've identified what is proficiency on that standard at every step, and they've articulated those things. So those are the things that I'm working with the elementary teachers on. Really, it's that nuts and bolts. But at the secondary level, it's a much heavier lift because we are still in that very traditional numeric setting, and having them even embrace some of these challenges, as you guys have pointed out, has been a challenge in and of itself. So moving them out of that traditional numeric, once and done, competitive sort of way this has always been, that points game essentially has absolutely been a challenge. But small wins with teachers to me are huge wins with students. And so the fight is worth it, and we continue to do. And yes, Gretel, even the teachers who allow, because they sometimes don't have a choice, even the teachers who allow those, summative retests, if you will, or late assignments, they don't necessarily all like it. they just sometimes don't have a choice. So, but even some of those who were vehemently opposed to that policy when it first rolled out, have begun to see the benefit for students and see the changes that has made in their classrooms. And I don't know about anybody else, but I firmly believe that is how we change teachers' hearts and minds, is for them to see the impact that some of the policies we enact, positive or negative, some of those impacts that they have on directly on their students. And when we can get them to see that, and then we can put small changes in place to help them to impact those in a positive way, well, that's the sweet spot, right? That's when we've all shown up and done a great job, and we can kind of go home because our work here is done. But we are getting down to the last 3 minutes. I really appreciate all of your participation, the questions, the responses in the CuraPod. Really appreciate the attention and time that you've given me this afternoon to share my experience and help me to hopefully pass that on to someone else to be of small benefit.
Tracy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your passion. This was just absolutely so inspiring. I think everybody watching kind of agrees. It's just your real life applicability to what you were sharing is exactly what we all need right now in the world of education. How do we actually go in tomorrow inspired, ready to do this work? Because ultimately, like you said, we all just want what's best for our students, and we want to build that mastery of learning. So we are so appreciative of your time. Just want to thank you so much. And everybody else, please feel free to continue engaging in the chat, or self-care during the break is essential as we're all kind of glued in. I know we're coming up close to the end of our day together today. So do as you need to. And I hope you all have a very calm and restful weekend. And remember to take care of your minds and bodies, most importantly.
Absolutely. So before you go, some things for Branching Minds. And finally, again, thanks to all of you. I really appreciate your attendance, your participation, and attention this afternoon.